Now don't get me wrong, I really like this episode too, but if you really think about it, the story doesn't make any sense. Hey everyone, and welcome to another Ranger Rant. I'm Archer9234. Today I'll be discussing episode 8 from Power Rangers Time Force titled Jen's Revenge. Now this episode is adapted from an episode of Time Ranger. For the most part, some of the story elements are used from Time Ranger. Now the episode starts off basically where we see that, Circuit is doing his usual job of checking all the containment aliens that are frozen inside their refrigerator. I always really like this aspect of Power Rangers Time Force because it's very unique in the sense that they didn't kill the monsters, they actually had to keep them frozen and in order to return them back to the year 3000. Now of course, since it's early in the morning, we're seeing all the other Rangers, usual early morning routines where we see, see Lucas as usual being obsessed with his hair, and you see him using globs of gel and stuff, and of course Katie and Trip are getting breakfast ready when all of a sudden we hear an alarm bell ring and we see that Wes is just waking up. Now this does make perfect sense because again, Wes was a rich guy, so everyone would assume he was like spoiled brat where he didn't have to actually do anything, wake up late and stuff. But it doesn't really make any sense the way the character was set up in the show because again, if you remember, his father, Mr. Collins, he was the one who wanted everyone punctual, right there on time. I don't understand how Wes would be allowed to be waking up very late in the day. After Wes falls onto the floor, he's wondering where Jen is and is trying to get breakfast ready. And Jen is basically practicing because again, since she treats her job very seriously, she's of course is going to wake up very early and training a lot, more so than the other Rangers. Wes is curious and heads out to look for her. We head basically to where Jen is actually training, and we see of course she still is resenting Ransik because again, Ransik's the one who killed Alex. Wes comes up, and of course Jen, again as usual, since Wes is the complete opposite of Alex's character and looks so much like him, she always resents him because of that. Since Wes is the one who always likes cheering people up and is trying to get, Jen to like relax. But unfortunately, since Jen again is, still wrapped up into what Ransik did to her life, Jen simply flips over Wes onto the floor and simply leaves him behind. Now we head back to Ransik's lair, and of course we see that he's releasing more mutants, and we see that a mutant comes out and he's called Fat Catfish. He was a notorious mutant that has done jobs in the past, and of course Ransik basically pays him with a lot of money. Fat Catfish simply destroys all the cyclobots in the room, and of course this is the beginning of where Frax starts, hating on organic human beings. I particularly never liked this story point because it came out of nowhere. It really didn't get set up in the beginning of the first few episodes. If you remember, Frax helped Ransik out and he was basically treated as evil, but at this point basically started seeing that robots are not cared for and are just, objects to people. Now the thing that really bugged me about this scene is that Fat Catfish and everyone else in there is from the year 3000. But Ransik pulls out the money, but he's using money from 2001. I'm always confused why the monsters never have any objection to us or never ask, like how come this is not, the current currency money at all? So as usual, when Nadira sees money, she's going to use any advantage as possible in order to buy whatever she wants. So of course she goes after Fat Catfish and they head out back on Earth in order to buy a whole bunch of stuff. So when we head back to Earth, we see that Nadira and Fat Catfish have been spending a lot of money, and we see that he was carrying a lot of purchases. I never really understood why Nadira is like this. 1 minute she'll attack people and don't really care about any repercussions in order to steal her items. But then there's this time where she'll have the money and simply buy everything like a normal person. So of course, since Nadira's been buying all the stuff, she's basically made Fat Catfish's money in order to do the Time Force job all moot. And of course, since Nadira never likes anyone who's basically broke, simply kicks him to the ground and simply leaves, Fat Catfish gets really pissed off at that. Now, when Fat Catfish gets pissed off, he simply destroys 2 buildings inside the city, and that's when the Rangers are alerted to his presence. Now, unfortunately, Time Force is one of the seasons that suffered from extensive censorship. Thanks to 9/11, a lot of things have been censored in Time Force for American audiences, rather than, normally with the international audiences. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, PR is heavily censored in international areas. For example, Europe, the UK, and other locations. I particularly never understood why that happens because I always thought to myself, American kid shows and family shows are already heavily censored enough over the years. If you watch back in the 80s and early 90s, shows were much different to basically today's standards, and very few shows today are ever kept in the old area where they allow things to go through. Unfortunately, when the fat catfish actually destroys the two buildings, this scene was actually censored. What happens in the original international / post 9/11 version is that when fat catfish actually destroys the two buildings in the original aired version of this episode, all you basically see is a car blowing up. Now, after Fat Catfish destroys the two buildings, the Rangers finally arrive on the scene and, of course, attempt to stop Fat Catfish. When all of a sudden the Pink Ranger actually remembers Fat Catfish from a previous mission where they actually originally sealed them away inside the freeze chambers with Alex. Now, I like to point out that the police car in the flashback is actually a repaint of the Knight Rider 4000 vehicle from the TV movie Knight Riders 2000. They actually did leave the original front hole in the front where Kit's visor would go, where the light goes back and forth. Now, for the very first time in Power Rangers history, we see that a Power Ranger is actually, taking the monster fight into their personal hands. This has never happened inside Power Rangers 4 and since then. Because normally when a Power Ranger fights a monster, there's never a personal grudge against them, usually in a case, and they simply just stop them. But in this case, Jen is actually taking revenge on Fat Catfishes thanks to Ransik actually killing Alex. Now, if you think about it, it doesn't really make any sense, because if you look back at the flashback that we saw how Alex took out Fat Catfish and no one was basically harmed in that scene, it doesn't really make any sense why Jen loses her cool and flat out wants to kill Fat Catfish. The reason why this happened was because of the Japanese footage. In the original Japanese story, what happened was Pink's family was murdered by Fat Catfish himself. And she was basically taking revenge on her family to Fat Catfish. That's the reason why she was acting this emotional and would flat out kill him right then and there. Now, of course, the other Rangers are attempting to stop Jen from actually, frankly, blowing Fat Catfish up to smithereens. I really like this moment because, again, it shows other aspects of people, because they would normally, a lot of times you would normally lose control of your emotions in the scene, and it should happen more often because, frankly, the Power Rangers are trying to save the world from monsters. Thousands to millions of people are killed every day during a monster fight because they're either destroying buildings whenever they're in their Megazord fight, or people are getting killed around where the monster is attacking the city. So it really doesn't make any sense why this doesn't happen any more often. Although the scene is very dulled down because basically we hear the word destroy. For a lot of lines, it doesn't really make any sense. Your blaster set to destroy. No one in real life would talk like that. Normally people would have said, your blaster set to kill. That's the thing I particularly never liked about Power Rangers. They always substitute the word kill with destroy in other words. It just doesn't make any sense from a vocabulary sense because no one would talk like that, but it doesn't make any sense to why would you want to censor the repercussions of what you're doing to kids, because you're trying to teach them a lesson to not kill people in cold blood. So Fat Catfish takes the chance while the other Rangers are trying to stop Jen from blowing him up and runs away. Unfortunately, Fat Catfish runs into Frax, and I'll basically tell Ransik that you failed to kill the right Time Force Rangers. Fat Catfish changes his tune from before when he destroyed all the robots that didn't care, and it's like, Frax, no, I'm your friend, you shouldn't tell Ransik. Both of them are basically double-crossing each other, and basically stole Fat Catfish's image into the holo card. So while Jen is walking through the park, she's basically trying to cool herself down of what had happened in the previous fight. And is, of course, unfortunately, seeing other people are having happy moments together. And when all of a sudden Frax throws a holo card at her, and of course she doesn't know who is it from, and she turns it on and basically sees that Fat Catfish is basically saying, "I'll betray Ransik if you just simply leave me alone and meet me over here." Now, unfortunately, since Jen is working on emotions and is not really caring about anyone else except stopping Ransik and Fat Catfish, she simply doesn't tell the other Rangers and leaves the clock tower late at night. Now, of course, this is a total ruse with Frax and is basically trying to take two birds with one stone, get rid of Fat Catfish with Ransik, but also trying to get the Pink Time Force Ranger by setting up two ambushes. Ransik finally arrives. Eventually, Fat Catfish realizes that Frax was tricked in order to get into there when basically Frax told Fat Catfish that Ransik wanted to talk to him, but then Frax told Ransik that he wanted to talk to him. Now, unfortunately, even though this is the perfect time for Jen to actually get Ransik, she's totally outnumbered, and of course, Frax is also prepared. Jen has to take on Ransik, Cyclobots, and Fat Catfish. As usual, Fat Catfish, chickens out of the scene. Jen has to fight off all the Cyclobots and, of course, Ransik. She doesn't really have that much of a problem with Cyclobots. Again, they're just, obvious junk minions, but unfortunately, she can't fight Ransik alone. Now, the thing I really hate is that, at no point in time did Jen think, I should call backup. Another thing that really pisses me off is that she at no point in time morphed. This happens a lot in Power Rangers. There are many times where they should simply morph and fight the monsters, but they don't, and this is the reason why they lose the fight. Now, since Ransik is extremely strong, he easily overpowers Jen, knocking her onto the floor, and is ready to give her a final blow with his mutated sword ability. When all of a sudden the Rangers get their first introduction to the where Ransik needs his medicine in order to stabilize his mutant DNA, because at this point in time we see that his mutant DNA is basically unstable and is causing extreme pain to him. When all of a sudden the Rangers finally come in and rescue Jen. Now, a lot of people are going to be thinking, how did the Time Force Rangers know where she was? They didn't know anything about the card. They didn't know anything about the plan. They were all asleep until Wes came downstairs and noticed that she was missing. Now, this is a one time where you don't really need to explain it, but basically, if you think about it, Circuit simply used her chronomorpher to locate her location. That's how the Rangers simply knew where to find her. After they return to the clock tower, we see that it's morning, and we see that Wes has been sleeping next to Jennifer's bed the whole entire time. Now, the thing I particularly liked about this scene is that Jen actually has injuries on her face and her arms, and which makes perfect logical sense because, again, she was beaten up by Ransik, and when you fight inside your suit, you're taking damage, so of course you're going to have injuries on you. Because if you notice, as the series progressed, less and less injuries are clearly visible on PR. So, of course, Fat Catfish finally finds out where Frax is and is going to actually, kill Frax this time because, again, he betrayed him and was using him as bait in order to get rid of him. When all of a sudden Jen locates where Fat Catfish and Frax is. Frax, as usual, is scared and simply goes off while Jen is fighting Fat Catfish. Now, eventually, Wes wakes up and finally alerts the other Rangers that Jen has run off again, and they head out to locate her. When Jen finally eventually overcomes the Fat Catfish and gets prepared to actually kill him at point-blank range. Now, in normal today's standards and practices, you're not allowed to point a gun directly at someone's face. Fortunately enough, this scene was actually not censored in the international or post 9/11 episodes, so you do get to see this moment. Now, eventually the Rangers finally arrive on the scene and are trying to convince Jen this is not right. Now, this scene also does bring up the issue where it doesn't make any sense why she's so emotional to Fat Catfish. She basically says, I want to kill him in order to take revenge on Ransik. Eventually, Wes uses logic and basically tells Jen, what would Alex do? And everyone would know that Alex is by the book, top of the line, would never use his emotions in the fight and would always arrest the mutant, freeze him, and always put him away to jail and not kill him. Jen realizes this and finally lets go of the trigger. Unfortunately, though, Fat Catfish takes advantage of this situation and actually knocks Jen onto the ground and eventually attacks the Rangers. So eventually, Jen goes back into her officer position and finally fights Fat Catfish fair and square. Now, for quick audience viewers, there are things in this scene that don't really make any sense. When Jen finally stops Fat Catfish and actually stops him with her V5, you'll notice that the camera actually zooms into a close-up onto all his necklace details. And then when we cut back to where Jen is spinning around and doing her heroic pose, you'll notice that she's holding two bracelets. Now, this happened because this is, again, the Japanese footage. Now, in the Time Ranger episode, Fat Catfish took mementos from people that he's killed. These two armbands are basically ID bands for Time Pink's family members, so she's basically taking them back. That's the reason why you see her have the armbands in her hand for a couple of seconds. So, of course, Fat Catfish rips off his, mutant DNA badge, and of course we get the obligatory Zorg fight where we see the Cyclone defense, and of course they switch over to mode red. Wes basically acknowledges this is your fight. Gives Jen the time sword, and she strikes him down and finally refreezes Fat Catfish into the containment. So after Fat Catfish is finally frozen, we head back to the clock tower, and Wes comes in and says, I'm not Alex. Jen finally admits to saying, no, I don't want you like Alex. You're Wes. You should be the way you are. And she finally admits that she likes him the way he is. And as usual in Time Force's style, we see the other Rangers hiding behind a barrel and unfortunately knocks it down. And of course everyone is busted and spying on, the Jen and Wes relationship where they're trying to figure out, like, is she going to finally say that she likes him or not? And Trip and Kitty are basically making fun of Jen and Wes. And of course Jen runs right after them. Now, I personally have to give this episode a 4 out of 5. I mean, it was a really good episode. I mean, it's one of the rare times where we actually can see a Ranger not thinking straight, being very passionate, and this is also the first time we actually see that a Ranger's not really caring about the monster life. He'll just blow him up and that's it. But I can't give it a perfect score because it just doesn't make any sense because, again, her grudge is against Ransik. Fat Catfish is not Ransik, so it really didn't make any sense why she was that pissed off. I understand that Jen wants to take some steam off him, but realistically, if they weren't using the Japanese footage, she wouldn't be this pissed off to actually just kill the monster right out and there. Now, another reason why I always love this episode is because, again, even though all through this turmoil, we still have funny moments with the cast and characters. We always see that family bond between them, and that's one thing I particularly liked about Time Force the most, is that all 6 cast members are always having that close relationship between one another, which is unfortunately lost in a lot of future Power Rangers episodes. The cast members are just together, but they really don't have that close bond that the Time Force Rangers have. What do you guys personally think? Do you think this episode was really amazing because they put Power Rangers into a more dark and grittier story? Or do you agree with me that it really didn't make any sense and it was kind of going out of character with Fat Catfish trying to basically just kill him in cold blood? Of course, leave your comments below on what you think about this episode, and of course, leave your comments below on what future episodes you would like me to review. For next week's rant, I'll be discussing White Light from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys right back here next week.